Hi Year 13, so this is the revision video for the gun. So I will do as I usually do, I'll skip through the bits that you'll already have notes on, and then I'll go through the sort of analysis of each stanza as well. So the starting activity that we did, we looked at some key terminology that we will apply to the poem, and we looked at sibilants, so that S and sh sounds that are often imitating hissing. And that is where you've got alliteration of that as well. Enjambment, so when a sentence runs over a line. And caesura, a pause created by usually a comma or a full stop in a line of poetry. Sometimes you have hyphens though as well that can create that same effect, or sometimes even ellipses. But typically it's usually a comma or a full stop. And then a lexical set, so words in a text that are linked by a common theme or a key theme. Alright, the poem then I've split over 2 slides, so I will read through it and then I'll sort of change the slide, read through the next bit, and then I'll put up some questions related to the poem for you to have a little think about. These are the same ones that came up in the lesson, so you should have some notes on that. Obviously if you were not in, this is an opportunity to have a go at that now. Okay, so the gun. Bringing a gun into the house changes it. You lay it on the table, stretched out like something dead itself. The grainy, polished woodstock jutting over the edge, the long metal barrel casting a grey shadow on the green-checked cloth. At first it's just practice, perforating tins dangling on orange string from trees in the garden, then a rabbit shot clean through the head. Soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. You trample fur and feathers. There's a spring in your step. Your eyes gleam like when sex was fresh. A gun brings a house alive. I join in the cooking, jointing and slicing, stirring and tasting, excited as if the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out the winter woods, his black mouth sprouting golden crocuses. Okay, so those key questions then that came up in the lesson were what you could infer from the title of the poem, where might you identify a shift in the tone, what impact does the gun have on the relationship between the speaker and the listener, and what do you feel is the poet's overall message on gun control. So as I said, if you were in the lesson you'll already have some notes on that, and if you weren't in the lesson obviously it gives you an opportunity to do that. But what I will now do is go through the poem stanza by stanza, so if you do want to pause and try answering the questions first before I get into my analysis, by all means do that. Otherwise you can just obviously check and add to your notes if you missed anything during that lesson. Okay, so analysing the poem then stanza by stanza. Obviously I did say not to neglect the title of the poem and make sure that you're making some inferences regarding the title, because you can obviously use that in your analysis. So the gun, that quantifier is sort of non-specific in terms of it could be related to any gun, but in this case as well it's referring specifically to a gun that the poet is maybe familiar with, because she is referring to the gun later on and looking at that specifically. The tone at the moment with the opening title is quite ambiguous. It's not really clear what her attitude is towards the gun. She's maybe uncertain of it herself, but it seems quite ambiguous to start with. So bringing a gun into a house, already we're starting with these sort of verbs that are fronted at the beginning of the lines, bringing and changing, these actions then as well that she's discussing. It's that idea of the responsibility and the fact that maybe particularly over in America where gun control is different to here in the UK, there is that idea of being responsible, and it's the person with the gun, not necessarily the gun itself, that's dangerous. But those sort of verbs are fronted there, so bringing and changing a gun into a house. We have this enjambment, this unnatural break as well, to sort of maybe emphasise this change, this difference that it makes. Additionally, we have this sort of very simple declarative sentence as well in this opening stanza. So it's very definitive, it's very much sort of resolved in the writer's mind, in the poet's mind, that a gun can have a very sort of big impact on a house and change it. It is interesting that the noun house is referred to there and not necessarily home. So maybe it hints that there are problems already, maybe in this relationship as well. But this whole stanza does act as almost a sentence topic for the rest of the poem. And we've got as well still a sense of ambiguity, so we don't know again whether that change is actually positive or negative. Going into the second stanza then, the personal pronoun you, the tone of that, it's unusual to see, not unusual, but it's difficult to see what, again, the tone is there. Is it accusatory? I've sort of questioned that there. You lay it on the kitchen table. And it's interesting that we've got sort of the kitchen being mentioned, because stereotypically the kitchen is usually seen as the domain of the woman, of the wife in the house and in the relationship. But it's the man coming in and producing this item and invading the kitchen with it almost. And then we have this personification then of the gun, so stretched out like something dead. So stretched, that verb, suggesting that it's sort of at ease where it is, and that's what sort of personifies it. The simile then, like something dead, maybe again foreshadowing. So it's how you use that gun that's going to then kill other things. So it's that link to death already, the deaths that are to come. And it's ironic, as there is an almost animalistic danger to this inanimate object. So although it is stretched out and it's an inanimate object, it seems like it's already something lethal, that it has a life of its own. Itself, the grainy polished wood. So, there's emphasis again on sort of showing that it's an inanimate object here, and that it's something man-made as well, this idea of it being polished wood, something that has been created by man. Those plosive sounds as well sort of reflect maybe the hard metal of the gun, the material of the gun, that's what it's made of. And it's quite sort of, those plosives being quite forceful and violent as well, like the gun itself. And jutting, sort of again suggesting almost an aggression there as well. And you have this antithesis between how the gun is described there. Later on, talking about the green checkered cloth, there's this antithesis, this stark contrast between this sort of highly polished, well-made gun and this bright, vivid, checked green cloth. So maybe suggesting that the gun shouldn't be there, that it's not sort of wanted there by the person writing the poem. So jutting over the edge, the long metal barrel casting a grey shadow. So this colour imagery is interesting as well. It's this dull colour, maybe an ominous tone to it as well. And again, that colour imagery contrasting with the green checkered cloth. So again, that enjambment as well, it's very kind of unsettling, the flow of this stanza. Maybe like the writer's feelings as well, that they feel unsettled by this presence of the gun. On to the next one then. So at first it's just practice. So this sort of sinister tone that at first, but actually worst is to come. So it starts off with this practice, and this colon there sort of adds impact, because we have to sort of pause and consider what is about to come, what's this going to lead to. Perforating tins. So perforating is to sort of punch a hole into something, and that's described in quite a violent kind of graphic way. That verb is quite forceful. And then obviously it's kind of building up to this ultimate act where the person that's brought the gun into the house has ended up killing an animal with it. Dangling on the orange string, so it talks about the tins, and these adjectives, this idea of the tins being hung up on this bright orange string, it almost gives it a decorative feeling, and maybe sort of suggesting that it's quite fun for the person doing this. There's an element of enjoyment, but actually that verb dangling as well might suggest a vulnerability and sort of the fact that it's exposed as well, that these tins are exposed, which isn't necessarily significant for the tins, but actually hints at that ominous feeling later on with the animals then that are killed, because they're going to be vulnerable. Then, so that adverbial sort of suggesting the escalating from the tins to the animals. Then a rabbit shot. So that end focus on that verb is quite stark and unexpected, and actually it's an unemotional killing as well, shot and then clean through the head. This is quite sort of stark imagery, that lack of emotion as well. So it's very precise and intentional as well. On to the next stanza then. So soon the fridge fills with creatures that have run and flown. So this idea as well, this alliterative focus as well on fridge fills, maybe mimicking that sense of fullness. So fridge fills, drawing as well the pace of the line out. So again, sort of reflecting that fullness. That have run and flown. So those verbs are important because it suggests that the freedom of those animals has been taken by that gun, that they can no longer run and fly, and it is in the past tense, so this is something that has happened to them now. Your hands. So again, there is maybe potentially a tone of accusation in that. Your hands reek, and reek is quite grotesque. Maybe there is an element of disgust there. Your hands reek of gun oil and entrails. So they're both sort of this idea of this weapon and the aftermath that the animals is sort of sticking and clinging to him, and that actually maybe there is a sense of trying to make him feel guilty for it. You trample, so again this sort of emphasis on you, and that's throughout this stanza as well. There's very much a focus, maybe again emphasising that accusatory tone. You trample, and that sort of verb is quite violent. Maybe it is the effect of the gun, it's rubbing off on him. You trample fur and feathers, so again we've got this alliteration, and maybe there is again a reflection of this softness in those lines, but the actual nouns themselves, the fur and feathers, are quite delicate, soft elements, and they contrast. Then there's antithesis between that and the earlier description, maybe for that polished hard wooden barrel of the gun as well, a metal barrel. There's a spring in your step, so there's maybe a little bit of a shift and change in tone there. There's a spring in your step because spring is a far more kind of uplifting verb almost. And the fact that she as well refers to that gleam, there's almost a sensual aspect to that, maybe even arousing, because then the simile obviously like when sex was fresh. But obviously it's sort of invigorating and energising the person with a gun, we assume is the husband, and then it's having then this knock-on effect, maybe it is bringing an element of excitement to their relationship, but it brings a spring in your step, like when sex was fresh. So that again, sort of that enjoyment, so it is quite almost dehumanising, that broad link and idea to sex, but also when it describes fresh, maybe there is a link there to the idea of fresh meat, and that could be quite grotesque really, that link. But there is that sort of, like I said, element of excitement and enjoyment, and maybe this is where we start to see maybe a little bit of a shift in the thoughts of the writer, and whereas before there seemed to be an element of disgust and an unwanted intrusion of the gun, now she's maybe changing her mind and becoming more sort of accepting of the gun's presence and what it's doing and the effect that it's having, particularly on her husband and then on their relationship as a knock-on effect. But there is very much this sort of hunting imagery that's used throughout, and in some sense this sort of line highlights it as being almost quite sexually arousing as well, that, like I said, tied into that feeling of excitement and enjoyment. And we have almost a refrain where there is this line being brought up again, where there is a change in the house, but it's less ambiguous now. A gun brings a house alive. Interesting that it's still referred to as a house and not a home, and the connotations that has with it maybe not being a homely or comforting place. But that sort of emphasis on it bringing it alive. There is an element of irony here as well. So the gun, which is something that kills and takes life, actually brings the house alive. So it's that shifting idea about the gun. As I said, the poet is rethinking her stance on guns, and as with the questions that I asked, this is where we can think really about that shifting idea about gun control as well. So maybe when it's something that you have and you're used to, that idea of tightening gun control is something that people reject because they're used to guns, and it has this positive impact in their life and on their maybe relationships. So it's interesting how she's had this shifting view and ideas, and whether we see that as something that is positive, this shifting idea of gun control, where she becomes quite she changes to a more positive stance with guns, whether she's saying that's quite dangerous because it has maybe this quite insidious effect where gradually she changes and she becomes accepting of the gun, or whether that's seen as a negative thing, or whether it's seen as a positive thing. We can only sort of offer those two different interpretations. But we have already throughout this lexical sets of words that are related to death. It almost permeates the poem, and at first it creates disgust, but actually towards the end here it's more positive. So now we have this idea then, she shifts the personal pronouns onto I. So is she now, as I said, more aligned with this idea? Is she more maybe energized by all this death that's taking place? But there's this definite shift in focus. She's becoming maybe more of an accomplice in this. And there's a sense of energy as well throughout this stanza, which we'll look at in a moment. We've got this colon as well. It does jar the flow, so maybe like the gun as well, that it's interrupted how their life was, and also how nature as well, the impact it's had on nature, because it's taken the lives of all these animals. But she's now complicit, jointing and slicing and stirring, so almost violent in her own way there as well with these verbs. And that, again, the alliteration, the sibilance, sort of emphasising that harshness as well. And tasting, excited. So again, there's sort of focus here on that verb, quite again sensual, maybe linking back to that sort of like when sex was fresh, that idea of excitement, as if the king of death. And there is an element of kind of patriarchy in this as well, because if it's her husband that's doing all this killing and catching of animals, it's a very kind of stereotypically masculine trait to be the kind of provider and hunter, and how he is having this kind of influence over almost like the domain of typically the female, which is the kitchen, but she's becoming an accomplice to that as well. But it's interesting that again this patriarchal influence of the king of death had arrived to feast, stalking out of the winter woods. So there's an element there as well of this kind of metaphorical idea of death coming. It's quite ominous, and there's quite almost a Gothic-esque feel to this part of the stanza, really. We have as well with King of Death, maybe there is that link to the idea of Hades, or maybe even Celtic mythology, so personifying death, maybe normalising it as well, and celebrating it, particularly the death of all these animals as well. His black mouth, so again that sort of dark element, death, sprouting golden crocuses. So interesting, in my opinion, I initially thought that it's that idea of celebrating death, and maybe this idea of a cycle, birth, death, and it being sort of repeated, and again sort of normalising that, and that I've made that comment there, maybe the idea of life after death. But with crocuses, they are sort of these vivid, very bright flowers, but they're quite deceptive because they're actually poisonous. So maybe like the gun, that they look appealing, but actually there's danger there. And maybe by normalising these deaths, there's danger with the gun as well. So as I have done previously, okay, I'll go through my notes as well. So we have some of the themes actually that I'll go on to talk about in a moment. So the idea of masculinity and power. So it's the male that feels empowered by the gun, and that power then it gives him over life and death with the lives of the animals that he takes. And the woman almost comes to comply with that. She feels that she has to comply, and she's the one then that makes the food, and she becomes complicit in it later on in the stanzas. But there's this idea again, as I said, that man has power over animals, and he feels he has that right to take their life. Death as well is one of the key ideas that is linked throughout the whole poem. Not only the death of the animals, but maybe also the death of the speaker's morals, because initially she is disgusted by the gun, but then she later joins in with the cooking of these animals that are brought into the house. But that death of the idea maybe that guns are bad, and that's where it maybe links to the idea of gun control. Alright, so key themes, as I've already mentioned there, I talked about masculinity and power. It's a key theme that's often explored in literature, and it's a key theme that has come up in other poems as well. Death, often explored in literature, as there are many profound and unanswerable questions surrounding death. I mean, certainly in this one as well, it talks about death and the sort of power that humans have over others, and when it comes to death and over creatures and animals. Conflict's another theme that is often explored in many texts and has been explored in previous poems as well. So you can see where all of these poems are starting to link really and converge when it comes to the themes. Particularly in this one, there is maybe conflict internally with the poet herself as she's exploring her ideas and her feelings towards gun control and the idea of the gun being brought into her house, but also as well maybe a conflict between her and her partner. Initially, the fact that she doesn't feel comfortable with the gun being in the house, and then obviously that changing as we gradually progress through the poem. So finally there, as always, those are the links to some of the websites that I have had a little look at to help me inform my own critical opinion of the poem. But by all means, I'll put those into the shared area, into our Google Drive, and you can use those and have a little look at those yourself. But as ever, if there's any issues, please do drop me a little email or send me a message on our Google Classroom. Okay, see you soon.